I was betrayed by my own family and accused of something I didn't do. So I faked my own death to start a new life and come back for revenge. Before anyone jumps to conclusions, no, I'm not some criminal mastermind or wannabe movie character. I'm just a guy who had everything ripped away from him overnight by the people who were supposed to love him the most. And when I realized there was no way to clear my name, I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I disappeared. The world thinks I died in a car crash 4 years ago, but I didn't. I built a new life, and now I'm back. Not for closure, but for justice. It started in 2019 in a small town outside of Austin, Texas. I was 27 back then. My family ran a construction business, Hale and Sons Contracting. My dad, Rick, built it from the ground up, and me and my older brother, Nate, were supposed to take it over one day. I handled the logistics, permits, payroll, accounting, while Nate was out in the field managing crews. We weren't best friends, but we made it work. Or at least, I thought we did. Around that time, we landed the biggest job our company had ever taken, a multi-million-dollar contract to build a new city complex. It was supposed to put us on the map. I worked nights, weekends, holidays, making sure everything was lined up. I missed birthdays, family dinners, even my girlfriend's graduation, because I believed this project would change everything for us. Then one Friday morning, I woke up to cops pounding on my apartment door. They had a warrant for embezzlement and fraud. I laughed at first because I thought it was a mistake, but the look on the detective's face told me it wasn't a joke. They said over $400,000 had been funneled out of the company's account into a private offshore account in my name. The nightmare that followed doesn't even feel real anymore. They took my phone, my laptop, all my documents. My dad wouldn't even look at me when I got to the station. Nate stood behind him with that smug, tight-lipped expression he always had when he knew he'd won something. I tried explaining that I didn't do it, that maybe our system got hacked or someone forged access credentials, but no one listened. My girlfriend, Emily, didn't even pick up my calls. I spent 3 nights in jail before my bail was posted. When I finally got home, my dad's truck was parked in front of my place. He walked in without knocking, slammed a folder down on my counter, and said, "You've shamed this family enough." Inside were bank statements and screenshots, evidence that pointed straight to me. I knew right away they were doctored. The timestamps were off, the routing numbers were unfamiliar, but it didn't matter. My dad made up his mind. "Stay away from us," he said before walking out. "You're no longer my son." That sentence still rings in my head like a gunshot. Over the next few weeks, my world collapsed. I got fired. Friends ghosted me. Emily blocked me on everything. I became the crook who stole from his own family. I didn't even fight back after a while. What was the point? My attorney said we might have a case, but even he looked doubtful. The story was everywhere: local news, social media, gossip blogs. I couldn't even walk into a grocery store without people whispering. Then, about 2 months later, I saw something that broke me completely. Nate was all over the papers. New CEO of Hale and Sons. My dad called him the son who stepped up when others failed. They even used my old designs in the announcement photo. That night, I drove out to a bridge about 30 miles from town and just sat there for hours. I didn't plan to jump, but I wanted the world to think I did. I left my car there, along with my wallet and phone. It took them 3 days to find me. They said my body was lost downstream. And after a week, they held a small memorial. I watched it online from a cheap motel room 2 states away. Nate gave a speech. He cried. Fake, perfect, manipulative tears. I took a bus west after that. Changed my name, grew a beard, worked cash jobs under the table. Construction, kitchens, even janitorial work. I stayed quiet, kept my head down, and started building something new. Every night, though, I'd replay that last conversation with my dad in my head. Every lie Nate told. Every time I begged for someone to believe me. And eventually, I realized I didn't want to just survive. I wanted to make them pay. It took me 2 years to rebuild my life. I learned everything about offshore banking, digital forensics, and corporate law. I made friends in unexpected places, people who'd been screwed over by their own families or partners. I found ways to gather information quietly, and I never stopped digging. Then, one night, I came across something that changed everything. A private contractor database that listed shell companies tied to Hale and Sons. One of them, Briar Logistics LLC, was the exact account where the missing money had been sent. Except now, it was under Nate's name. That was my confirmation. He framed me. My brother, my blood, stole everything and used me as his scapegoat. That was the moment I stopped being the victim. I decided I was going to burn everything he'd built and make sure they all saw me do it. And if they thought I was dead, well, that was going to make the reveal so much sweeter. They deserved the slow, teeth-grinding version of justice. Not fireworks, not a single explosive moment, but a steady unraveling that would make them question every truth they'd stacked like kindling. That's what I told myself as I started planning. I had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. For the first year after I disappeared, I kept it simple: survival, disappearance maintenance, and learning to be invisible. But once the immediate shock faded, the real work began. I didn't want to rely on luck. I wanted proof. I wanted a map from the smoke and mirrors they used to burn my name to the people who actually set the matches. Step 1 was information. I figured out how to re-enter the world without leaving obvious footprints. I used cash for months, then crypto through mixes for anything bigger, and set up a new, clean identity. Not stolen, but manufactured carefully using a deceased person's public records and blank slate paperwork. I learned how to open a small business without leaving a digital breadcrumb trail, how to rent a P.O. box that couldn't be casually traced, and most importantly, how to make friends who didn't ask questions. I worked every job I could find that paid under the table. Construction sites, food trucks, a mechanic shop. Hands-on work let me blend in and gave me access to people who knew how things move when you don't want them to be tracked. I listened more than I spoke. People mention things when they think no one cares. Names, shell companies, account managers who handle things quietly. I kept notes in a pocket notebook, real paper, and memorized patterns. 2 years in, I found my first real lead, Breyer Logistics. It was a name that popped up in scrapings of contract records, a shell tied to small municipal projects. At first it was just a line, a vendor in some procurement spreadsheet, but every line had context. I started pulling every public filing, vendor invoice, and subcontractor list connected to Breyer. The threads led to smaller LLCs and to a payroll service that, oddly, had no physical office but listed Nate's home as a mailing address in one old PDF. I didn't rush. I ran the names through people I trusted, not lawyers, not cops, but a couple of freelance investigators I'd met through odd jobs and late-night forum threads. They were good at finding things behind paywalls and server logs. They found that Breyer had been used as a pass-through for several consulting payments. The invoices were thinly worded, often for site management oversight and project facilitation. The amounts lined up almost perfectly with the missing funds. The kicker was a pattern in the routing, a recurring transfer that hit a Cayman account for a 3-month stretch in 2019, right when the money disappeared. It was routed through a bank that specialized in corporate escrow for construction projects. The bank records themselves were locked down tight, but with the right questions and the right pressure, leaks happen. People with access talk. And, as I learned, people with something to hide lie loudly to cover the small stuff and then forget the big picture. I started to build a dossier. Not for revenge in the melodramatic sense, not yet, but a dossier that would survive a courtroom and not look like the ramblings of a crazed son. I saved screenshots, archived PDFs, requested FOIA documents for municipal projects where Hale and Sons had won bids. I sent innocuous emails from burner accounts to third-party vendors, watching for slip-ups. I bribed 2 low-level contractors to hand over copies of invoices they'd thought were confidential. Every breadcrumb mattered. All the while, I kept one other goal in mind: get close enough to the company without blowing my cover. That meant a job with a subcontractor Hale and Sons used. I landed work with a small outfit that did site surveys. Low pay, long drives, good access. Nate didn't recognize me. He had no idea the guy in the pickup with the faded work jacket sweating through shift after shift was the son he'd buried. I watched him from the perimeter. The way he moved on site, who he trusted, how he handled paperwork. The arrogance hadn't changed. He still smiled like the world owed him something. There were nights I almost gave up. The loneliness of living a ghost's life is deeper than you'd expect. You miss birthdays and funerals and the stupid little rituals that make a life. I missed Emily in a way that hurt physically, not because I wanted her back, but because she represented the normal life I'd been stripped of. Sometimes I wondered if I'd become what I hated, someone who destroyed everything for the sake of being believed. But every time I held one of those forged invoices in my hand, or traced a payment from a municipal escrow to an anonymous trust, the doubt faded. I started to think of my actions less as vengeance and more as undoing a lie. If I could expose the rot, maybe someone else wouldn't get burned the way I did. Maybe the city would cancel future contracts. Maybe families wouldn't lose savings because of people like Nate. I also began to test the limits of what I could do legally. I contacted a whistleblower attorney under my alias, not to file a complaint yet, but to understand what would be needed to get the attention of regulators and prosecutors. The attorney's checklist became my blueprint. Bank records, corroborating witnesses, signed invoices linking the shell companies to the internal approvals at Hale and Sons. Everything had to be lined up so that when I pulled the thread, the whole thing didn't fray into hearsay. The deeper I dug, the more obvious one thing became. This wasn't just greed. It was choreography. Someone had planned the scapegoat early on. The pattern of transactions had contingency payments, cleanup transfers, and a backup invoice system that only kicked in when an audit was likely. Whoever set this up understood corporate audits. Whoever set this up had access and influence. Whoever set this up had used me as a predictable piece because I was the softest target, the kid who kept his head down and trusted family. And that realization burned hotter than any desire for public humiliation. It wasn't enough to show they'd stolen. I wanted to show they had knowingly framed me. That would be the part of the reveal that mattered. People can forgive theft sometimes. They don't forgive betrayal. By the end of year 3, I had enough to stop being patient. I had names, dates, and a paper trail that pointed to Breyer Logistics, the anonymous trust, and, crucially, a recurring consultant listed under a name that, with a little digging, tied back to an accounting firm Nate relied on. The accounting firm was small, family-run, exactly the kind of business that would be willing to help if the money smelled like opportunity. I set the plan in motion in the most boring way possible. I opened an encrypted Dropbox of documents and seeded it to a journalist who covered corruption in municipal contracting. I didn't send everything, not yet, just enough to make them look. Then I watched, waiting for the journalist's reaction like a kid waiting for a reply to a text. The reply came at 2 a.m. It was the sound of a match striking. The journalist's reply was short and clinical. "This is interesting. Can we talk?" But the timestamp felt like a thunderclap at 2 a.m. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a motel lobby with a cold coffee and my laptop, fingers hovering over the mouse like I was defusing something delicate. I'd expected curiosity. I hadn't expected speed. But the more I'd learned, the more I'd accepted that when you give someone the right thread, they'll pull. They ran a piece 3 days later. Not an expose, not yet, but a careful, source story about irregularities in municipal contracting tied to a shell called Breyer Logistics. It quoted municipal records, a contractor who'd requested anonymity, and the thin invoices I'd provided. I watched the analytics for the site like a surgeon watches a screen. The story spread to a couple of trade sites. Then local news picked it up. The comments were messy, predictable. Some people skeptical, some angry, and a few who remembered the Hale and Sons scandal and wondered if it was connected. The first visible crack in the facade was small. A city inspector called Hale and Sons to ask about an invoice. Nate returned the call in front of a foreman, smiling like he always did. But by the end of the day, that smile was gone. The foreman told me later that Nate went pale, made excuses about misplaced paperwork, and asked for those invoices on his desk. Panic, I learned, has a look, thin, fast, and ugly. I could have celebrated when the board of a small municipal authority quietly froze payments to Breyer. Instead, I felt sick. Watching them scramble felt like watching an infection you'd once had returned to the surface. For months, I trained myself to be cold, but certain moments hit in ways I hadn't expected. The way my chest hollowed when I saw a photo of my dad in the local paper looking tired and embarrassed. The way my name, the name I'd buried, got a new sentence in a reporter's inbox. People who had written me off as dead started whispering my name again, but not the way I wanted. The journalist wanted more. He asked if there were additional records, if anyone could corroborate payment paths. I gave him what I could without exposing my methods. I withheld certain logs, the direct trail to the Cayman Trust. Not because I wanted to hoard power, but because a reveal that tidy would bring federal attention too fast and below the timing I'd planned. There's an art to breaking someone. Sometimes you let them flail by the lights. Sometimes you snap the power entirely. I chose the former. Nate's reaction was textbook damage control. He issued a public statement. Hale and Sons was cooperating with inquiries. They welcomed transparency. They were confident this was an outside vendor issue. It was the kind of PR that smells like guilt. They brought an outside auditor, a small boutique firm that advertised clean hands and rapid reconciliation. That firm had been used by several regional contractors I tracked. Coincidence? I didn't think so. Inside the company, the atmosphere shifted. Employees who had treated me like a pariah when I was accused started acting like the story was a bad dream they'd rather wake from. A couple of lower-level clerks who'd balked at Nate's orders began quietly backing up files, sending encrypted messages to contacts I'd arranged. It was slow, messy, human. One woman, Jenna from payroll, texted me from a burner and said, "If something happens to me, look at folder X." I told her to breathe, to keep calm, to do what I told her. She did. She sent invoices with names and routing numbers that tied Breyer to accounts that had been funneled through a small escrow company. Those invoices were the kind of thing a court likes, signed, dated, with matching purchase orders. Every time I received something like that, I felt a little less like a ghost and a little more like a man rebuilding himself out of evidence. But it didn't erase the emptiness. My dad's name showed up in one email thread I'd obtained from a disgruntled vendor. He'd asked if a discreet handling was possible. It wasn't explicit, but it was the sort of hint that made you look at someone differently. I had a photograph of that email on my screen at 4 a.m., and for the first time since I'd left, I cried. Not theatrical sobs, a quiet, unavoidable breaking. It wasn't about justice then. It was grief for the version of my father I had once believed in. The public pressure mounted. A local councilwoman demanded an audit. Nate hired a high-powered defense attorney who started leaking their own counter-narrative to the press. Maybe the city's procurement process was flawed. Maybe vendors were exploiting loopholes. Maybe the media was rushing to judgment. The attorney's statements were polished, but his eyes were different in the photos, watchful, calculating. He didn't just want to refute claims. He wanted to find the source and burn it. That was where things got dangerous. I'd expected legal fireworks, but I hadn't fully prepared for the attention. Someone started asking questions about how the journalist had obtained the records. A private investigator began showing up near subcontractor offices. A man in a suit once came to a cafe where I worked an overnight shift and asked about a former Hale and Sons accountant who'd emailed a reporter. He left with nothing, but his presence put people on edge. I adjusted. I tightened comms, moved drop points, rotated payment methods. I made sure I never met a source face-to-face when there was no cover. I paid attention to small things, taxi drivers who remembered faces, baristas who repeated details. All of those little sloppy things can be leveraged by the very people you're trying to hurt. I'd learned that lesson when my old life ripped apart. Meanwhile, the human costs kept piling. Jenna's inbox was suddenly full of HR requests. She was pulled into a meeting and came out white. They want to recheck every invoice since 2018. She whispered in a voice that sounded like someone who'd been woken from a nightmare. She told me she was terrified she'd be fired, or worse, subpoenaed. I promised I'd protect her identity, but promises are fragile when you're not sure what you can legally give. Nate pushed back publicly and privately. He threatened lawsuits. He made quiet calls to donors and city officials. He leaned on partners to say the story was inaccurate. He tried to make the scandal about process rather than fraud. That was his strategy, muddy the waters. I needed clarity. So I fed the journalist a file that was small but precise. A single consultant invoice with a forged signature that matched a travel receipt Nate had paid for in a company ledger. It was the first hard link that tied Nate's approvals to a payment that ended up in Breyer's account. When the follow-up article dropped, with that invoice front and center, I sat in a motel and watched Nate's world crack in real time. He was still the same person who stole my life, but now the people who loved him had to reconcile the image they'd been sold with the new evidence. Watching a man you hate lose his footing is not as satisfying as movies make it seem. There's a coldness to it, a recognition that you're unspooling the life of someone who once shared your blood. The satisfaction, I'd imagine, stayed stubbornly out of reach. By the time the local paper ran an opinion piece about corporate governance and family-run businesses, the town's gossip circuits were humming. People who'd once whispered my name with scorn now texted to ask if I was okay. The messages were hollow, curiosity without contrition, but they mattered. Each one was proof that my existence, the one they'd tried to erase, still had weight. And somewhere in that noise, someone unlocked a truth I couldn't stand ignoring. I missed being seen as more than a scandal. I missed being able to walk down a street without feeling like everyone was measuring me against a story. I missed the ordinary things that build a life. Those losses didn't make me soft. They made the goal clearer. I wasn't doing this to watch them suffer for suffering's sake. I was doing it so they would have to face what they'd done to another human being who trusted them. The next steps would be riskier. The auditor was tightening, subpoenas were being drafted, and Nate's attorney was sharpening knives. I had to decide how far I was willing to go to make them look at the whole truth, and whether I had the stomach for what the finish line would demand. That decision waited with the sunrise. I logged off, packed my bag, and drove. I told myself I wanted the slow burn, a surgical unpicking of their lies. But there's a point where the work you've done demands a stage. The journalist kept pressing. The whistleblower attorney, under my alias, pushed the same way lawyers do, quietly, insistently, with eyes on procedure. We fed the DA's office a steady drip of material. Invoices, routing trails, vendor confirmations, Jenna's files, and watched them turn it into something that looked like real momentum. Subpoenas, freeze orders, and finally, the kind of federal interest that makes even small-town power players sweat. When the grand jury subpoena hit Nate, he laughed in public and cursed in private. He tried to bribe an auditor. He called donors. He sent his goons to sift through payroll closets like men smuggling contraband. That laugh mattered. It was the same smug laugh he'd used the night they cut me out. Only this time, he hadn't thought about the person who'd been living with nothing to lose. I didn't go to his first court date. I watched a shaky live stream in a diner somewhere outside Albuquerque and kept my head down while a man I'd once sat across a Thanksgiving table from listened to an indictment read in a flat, official voice. When the judge set the arraignment for a Tuesday, I booked a flight that afternoon. I told no one where I'd be staying. I changed shirts twice on the way to the courthouse. The plan wasn't clever. It was theatrical, and I knew the two could coexist. I wanted them to see me when they were most vulnerable, when the law had them by the throat and the town's sympathy was a currency Nate could no longer buy. I wanted my dad, who still thought he'd settled his conscience with my death, to have to face me in front of people. I wanted Emily to look across a courtroom and see that the girl who left me had been wrong. But mostly I wanted Nate to stop pretending he hadn't done what he did. Courtrooms are weirdly democratic. Everyone looks small under the fluorescent lights. I sat in the overflow gallery in an old hoodie, hair shorter than during my death, my beard tighter, a new name in the corner of the ticket stub in my pocket. I could have kept the illusion forever, stayed invisible, watched them die in a slow, bureaucratic purgatory. But the human part of me, the one that had once hoped for reconciliation and never got it, wanted something more tangible than paper evidence. When Nate walked in, flanked by his lawyer, he still had that look, the kind of complacent irritation you get when your day's schedule is interrupted. He didn't look to the gallery. He never did. When my dad entered later, thinner, hair grayer, shoulders rounded, he scanned the room like a man trying to orient himself in a life he'd half forgotten. For a moment, I hoped he'd see me. He didn't. The arraignment left the room in a hum of phone calls and whispered questions. Nate's attorney asked for bail. The DA argued for pretrial detention. There was talk about flight risk, about access to accountants and foreign trusts. After the judge adjourned, people in the gallery filed out in a slow, disinterested river. That's when I stood. I remember the sound of my shoes on the courthouse tile. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was just me moving where people expected a ghost to remain. When my dad looked up and saw me, the color left his face like water draining from a sink. He didn't run. He didn't collapse. He just stared, mouth open, as if trying to find a point in a sentence he'd started and couldn't finish. Nate's eyes narrowed, a predator recognizing the one animal he'd thought he'd put down. Whispers crashed around us. Someone gasped. A woman began sobbing in the back. I'd planned what to say. Nothing long, nothing poetic. The law is a messy ladder. I wouldn't climb it with theatrics. I wanted them to feel the moment purely, to know they'd been wrong about the last thing they thought they'd claimed, my death. Surprised? I asked, in a voice that sounded older than I felt. It landed like a thrown stone. My dad stood up like a man pulled by a rope. You, he started, then stopped. For a second, he looked young, the way he had before the company and the concessions and the quiet compromises. You're alive, he said, and the sentence was both an accusation and a prayer. I wasn't alive to you, I answered. So I fixed that. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I let the courtroom fill in the rest. Nate's lawyer tried to intercept, to move me out of the gallery, to turn the moment into a procedural disruption. The judge, caught between maintaining order and the obvious human rupture playing out in his courtroom, allowed it to happen. Cameras, the professional kind, angled for the shot, because everyone knows what a reveal looks like once it's been filmed. Emily wasn't there. She'd moved on years ago. I'd not come back for her forgiveness. But she watched the video the next day like everyone else. Her message to me, a single line, landed with an odd mixture of relief and accusation. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to answer, to explain how betrayal had hammered the truth into a shape I couldn't fit into anyone's life. Instead, I sent her nothing. Words are heavy when someone's already dead to you. The fallout was immediate and glorious in the way truth is messy, irreversible, and oddly cleansing. People lined up to talk to reporters. My dad said he'd been misled and that he wished he'd asked more questions. Nate looked smaller on the front page, a man flanked by legal counsel whose confident grin had cracked into a worried line. The DA's office confirmed a widening investigation. My old phone buzzed with messages from anonymous accounts, threats, apologies, the occasional plea. The town felt rearranged. Privately, I sat on the curb outside the courthouse and let it happen without me. I watched my father's silhouette through the courthouse window and wondered if years of complicity could be carved away by a single public admission. I wondered if he'd ever understand what it meant to be abandoned by what you loved. He texted later that day, 3 words. We need to talk. We did talk. But not then. Not cleanly. There were lawyers, subpoenas, and the slow machinery of accountability. The truth had teeth now. It could bite, and I'd sharpened every edge. I didn't get everything I wanted that week. You don't usually. Justice moves on a timetable, and revenge is a hunger that doesn't respect calendars. But for the first time since I left my car on that bridge, I felt seen by the people who'd made me invisible. That feeling was both fragile and fierce. The next move would be the hardest. It would force me to choose between the small, savage pleasures of watching them lose everything and the far colder work of making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. I'd spent years learning how to disappear. Now I needed to learn how to stay, not as a ghost, but as someone who would rebuild, testify, and maybe forgive. The trial was the kind of thing you only see in tight little towns when everyone's fed enough irony to keep the rumor mill lubricated for years. It dragged on longer than anyone predicted. Testimonies, depositions, a messy parade of accountants who looked like they'd been scraped off different floors of the same corporate conference. I testified under my alias that I'd used to contact the DA. The judge let it slide once everything was on the record. That felt like a small victory. The living version of me finally had a seat at a table where people had only ever spoken about my death. Sitting in the witness box, under those courtroom lights, I felt every shard of the last 4 years sharpen into a muscle. Jenna's hands shook when she signed her affidavit, and seeing her face, pale, real, made me remember why I'd done this. It wasn't for viral clips or theatrical moments. It was for people like her who trusted the system and got burned because someone with a last name and a poker face decided they were expendable. Nate's cross-examination was clinical. His lawyer aimed to make me look like a grudge holder, bitter, biased, unreliable. They played my old texts, snipped and rearranged, trying to make my grief look like motivation. They dredged up the why of my disappearance, painting it as evidence of instability. I didn't rise to it. Anger can be useful, but the calm, precise truth is usually more devastating. I stuck to the paper trail, invoices, routing numbers, signed purchase orders. I let the numbers speak while my voice stayed steady. When the jury convicted Nate on multiple counts, fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, the sound in the courtroom felt like a release valve. He was sentenced to several years and ordered to forfeit assets tied to the scheme. Seeing him let out in handcuffs was complicated. There was no glee. I had imagined 1,000 triumphant moments. Reality was a flat, heavy thing that didn't care about my imagination. The part one hadn't expected was how small it made him look in my head. A man reduced not by cinematic downfall, but by paperwork and witness statements. The universe is weirder than a script. My dad never faced criminal charges. The DA said there wasn't enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he directly authorized the scheme. He did, however, face professional ruin. Clients pulled contracts, banks closed lines of credit, and his name, once a brand in that area, became a footnote in articles about corporate negligence and family-run companies gone toxic. He called me from a number I didn't recognize one cold morning after the verdict. "Can we talk?" he said, in a voice that wanted bargaining more than reconciliation. We met at a diner on the edge of town because it felt neutral and because neutral was the only place my head could handle him. He arrived with a coat several sizes too big and a confession folded into the way he avoided my eyes. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He said quietly, I believed him. It was the lamest defense, and also the thing that hurt the most. He had chosen to believe his son over his other son because it fit a story that protected him. That was the betrayal, not the theft itself, but the willingness to weaponize a son to save a business. I told him what I needed: accountability, transparency, and for him to stop weaving excuses that sounded like excuses. He promised things he couldn't legally make true. We didn't hug. We didn't reconcile in some neat, cinematic way. But we talked for hours. He wanted my forgiveness. I wanted his honesty. That's where we started. Long, halting sentences toward a place neither of us was sure existed. People asked me afterward if seeing Nate in court felt like closure. It did, and it didn't. There are things that a sentence can fix: financial restitution, the formal record, the public recognition that the story people believed wasn't the real one. But it can't fix the private stuff. Birthdays missed, relationships shattered, the taste of being told your family prefers a narrative to your truth. Those things settle like dust. You can clean them, but they come back if you don't keep at it. The hardest part was rebuilding trust with the world and with myself. I reestablished my legal identity slowly. There were meetings with the DA about witnesses, phone calls with an attorney about restitution, and a small civil suit we filed to recoup corporate losses. Money came back in drips and puddles, not in the cinematic lump sum I'd sometimes fantasized about. We recovered enough to keep people paid and to start repairing what had been broken in the company's wake. I also found unexpected kindness. A local contractor, an old man who'd once been a client of my dad's, offered me a small job helping with compliance procedures for municipal bids. He said, plainly, "We need someone who knows what it looks like when things go wrong." That was the first time since the bridge I felt useful in a way that wasn't just strategic. I worked, I taught, and I kept my head down on purpose. The personal stuff was messy. Emily sent a longer message months later, something that read like an apology folded inside a closure. We met once at a coffee shop. There were no tears, no blown-up scenes, just two people who'd been young and messy and made different choices. She said she'd been scared and had chosen safety. I didn't hate her for it. I told her I carried no revenge for her. That felt true and freeing in a way that surprised me. Revenge, I learned, is overrated. What I wanted most, in the end, was to be believed, to be seen, to have my life acknowledged as having continued in spite of what they'd made me. The public reveal did that. The trial did that. The settlement did that. But the quiet victories, people returning calls, a former coworker saying, "We were wrong about you," a child I didn't know telling their parent, "My dad said your dad's company helped build our school." Those were the things that felt like actual repair. I kept my options open after everything. I could have sued my way into comfortable obscurity, or I could have stayed and helped rebuild the company with stricter oversight and new leadership. I chose neither and both. I took a modest role as a consultant helping municipal contractors avoid the pitfalls that had ruined so many lives. It's not glamorous, but it helps. It lets me use the dark years for something that doesn't taste like bitterness. On nights when the old anger returns, I let it. I sit with it like an old scar, tug at it, watch it sting, then move on. Healing isn't a line you cross. It's a practice you adopt. I date. I work. I keep my beard trimmed and my name on forms that match the person I am now. If there's a moral to this mess, it's that people are fallible and systems are porous. Families are not safety nets by default. They're made of choices. I reclaimed a life that was nearly stolen, and I learned the cost of letting others define your story. That's not a neat ending. It's an ongoing one. And that's fine. I'm alive. I fought. I won parts of it and lost others. But most days now, I wake up and the breathing part of survival feels like a choice I made and not a sentence someone else handed me. If you made it all the way to the end, thanks for sticking with me. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing to the channel and giving the video a like. It helps me share more stories like this. Thanks.